Is it safe to come out yet? I'm just going to peek out a little bit and double check. It looks safe, but is Ebola over? It's actually been much worse than I thought. Are these the only people who survived?
No, you're at the AAS conference.
The AAS conference. Okay, well, I think somebody's going to have to bring me up to speed. Maybe you could, on what's been going on. If we think back, it was just 2.5 years ago that there was a little story on the internet, and that was somewhere behind Kim Kardashian breaking the internet. But it was the story of Ebola. It was the largest epidemic in human history, 25,000 people. 10,000 had died, including many healthcare workers. And we weren't paying it much attention because what? Because it was over there. It was in Western Africa. And all that changed on September 30th of 2014 when Thomas Eric Duncan at Texas Health Presbyterian in Dallas contracted the disease and was being treated. And we feared that patient 0, who then infected 2 nurses, and we anticipated that this could spread and spread. So is that what happened? Could you just bring me up to speed a little bit? So Thomas Eric Duncan, we're pretty clear he was going to die. How many millions died after that? None? 0 died. Okay, well, appreciate you bringing me up to speed on that. I might have overreacted. I've been back here for 2.5 years. I may need a shower at this point. We expected a massive spread of the Ebola virus, but we're a scientific, a capable, a thoughtful, and an intelligent nation. So we did what anyone would do. We panicked. We did the equivalent of throwing our arms in the air and turning around 3 times and yelling zombie apocalypse. Now, I clearly may have overreacted. I may actually have caught Ebola, this $2,000 hazmat suit I bought on eBay for $90. So, but how many of you also overreacted? You thought this disease was coming to your community, or you thought it was coming to your family? Raise your hand. One honest person. Thank you. The Boston Globe said that half of us thought it was coming to our community, and 1 in 3 said it would infect somebody in their family. This got really out of control. How many of you remember the helicopters that were chasing the nurse that dared defy the quarantine and went for a bike ride? Now, 2 Americans, there was actually a third who came in from another country, but only 2 Americans actually infected from Thomas Eric Duncan, those 2 nurses. And yet, how much money did we appropriate in the fall of 2014 by Congress and the President for Ebola? $7.5 billion. Now, Ebola did not hold exclusive claim on the issue of contagion in the year 2014. Julie referenced earlier, beloved Robin Williams died. And when he did, a lot of our discussion had to do with this tweet from the Motion Picture Academy. Jeannie, you're free. And we talked about the fear of contagion. We talked about that if you use the word suicide in a title of a news story, if you use it repeatedly, if you talk about the methodology, or if you give a sense that there might be a release, that suicide is contagious and can spread. Now, let's go back to Ebola for a moment, and I'm going to need some help. Let me exit this. This is a lot harder than you might think. All right. And this was our policymakers, our government leaders, our scientists, the CDC, the CNN. We were all fearing an apocalypse. And in the midst of that, Will Humble, who happens to be the public health director here in Arizona, he wrote a blog. Wasn't read by many, but he said, hold on a moment. There is a science that we should think about in the midst of our fear. And there is a metric called the R-naught. It's the reproductive rate of any infectious disease. This is the R-naught formula. It's essentially the number of new cases that an existing case generates on average over the infectious period of any susceptible population. If the R-naught is less than 1, if on average I'm going to infect less than one other person, a disease can't continue. If it's 1, it will go very slow. If it's 2 or 3 or more, you can see that it can spread. On the far right is a disease with an R-naught of 18. One person in an unvaccinated population will infect 18 others. Those 18 will each infect 18 others. Those 72 will each infect 18 others, those 1,296. And that's what we feared about Ebola. But what Will said was, let's understand R-naught. Why do different diseases have different R-naughts? It has to do with how long it takes to incubate, how long the person is infectious, weeks, days, lifetime, and how is it spread? Is there a vaccination in the population? In this particular case, we're looking at measles, which goes through the mists and the mucus and the spray in the air. So when we had an individual in 2015 at Disneyland with measles, that spread to hundreds of people across 5 states quickly. What Will Humble wrote was, don't get me wrong, Ebola is a deadly disease, but it's actually the least infectious we know of. Oh, you remember SARS, which was behind the Contagion movie when we all started using the hand sanitizer. That was a deadly disease that spread worldwide. Measles, 12 to 18 other individuals. A lot of mumps in the news lately, 15 to 18. Ebola is just hovering above 1. He wrote that right as the rest of us were panicking because he had his eyes directly on the science, and it was clear. Now you can study and you can look at R-naught till your heart's content. Suicide is not in any way comparable to any of those infectious diseases. Its R-naught is 0. We talked last year about suicide being the result of intolerable pain. Intolerable pain isn't what's catching. Now, we do have instances that we in suicide prevention struggle with. We refer to them as clusters. Here's a cluster that occurred outside of Dublin, Ireland. Within the course of a few weeks and a few short months, we had 3 individuals who died. Young females in the ages of 12 to 17 that all knew of one another, in some cases knew each other, and they died. We don't want to trivialize suicide as some kind of random choice that sprays from one person to another. So what is it that's going on? Now, this is an actual picture of my grandpappy and a mastodon that was chasing him. We are here over hundreds of thousands of years not because we're the apex predator, but because of a powerful self-preservation that is built into us. We have a security system that is unassailable. How many of you in the room know of someone, or you yourself would not be here without medical care, medical intervention? My mother had a melanoma removed from her leg that was there far too long, and we were so thankful. That was almost 15 years ago now. Without medical care, without the screening and intervention, she probably wouldn't be here. Some of us would also not be here because we went through such intolerable anguish that if suicide was a light switch on our arm, we would have found a way to pull it. Now, our amygdala would have fired deadly fear messages and said, don't do it. But we might have found a way. Many of us are here because there's a wall, a security system that seems very difficult to get across, if not impossible. So what happened with those 3 young girls, the 2 of which followed? Maddie Gould has proven that people don't catch suicide because we ask them. I think we had 3 young women in intolerable anguish and pain, but who assumed that they could not get over that security system, that was impossible. I ran a mud runner. I found out that a mud runner is not a run. It's a boot camp. And 2 miles in, I said, I'd never quit anything, much less but I came up against this wall with no handholds, and an intoxicated small dog would have done better than I did when I hit that wall. And I backed up. I put my hands on my knees and said, how do you quit? Where do I go? Where's the exit? Because that is impossible to cross. And the moment I did that, I saw a whir go past me. And I looked at that blur, and it was a young woman about a foot shorter than me. Not necessarily a runner's build, but she went flying into that wall, and her foot hit it like an arrow. And she catapulted up, and somehow she got the tips of her fingers on the top of that wall. She took her left leg, flopped it up, her toe touched the top of that wall, and then she flipped over and was gone. And I said, what do you know? And in an instant, something I thought was physically impossible for me to achieve, I knew was totally achievable. Now, I did watch her technique, so don't get me wrong. I followed through and did what she did. But the key factor was someone like me did something I thought was impossible to do. And I did it in the very next try. And I believe those 3 young women, when one of them saw that someone like them, it's not so much the media per se, it's I learned somebody like me did something that was impossible. That's dangerous. It's the courage that spreads, not the suicide. Courage is contagious, dangerous in this regard. Now, the courage we talk about in our culture is the courage to die. Those are the discussions that come up. Robin Williams, Kurt Cobain, etc. Suicide is really, in many ways, kind of the last stigma. It doesn't need any extra help. But we've made it hard. We've had a culture where the voice is to talk about the courage to live, the courage to hang on, the courage to somehow find a way to survive or even thrive. If we go back to our conference in 1987, those voices weren't heard here. They weren't heard really anywhere. They were silent. We ran in panic from Ebola, but we just shut down the conversation because we were in our safety suit. Let's protect, let's not have contagion. In 1990, that was all breached by patient zero, William Styron, who wrote intimately about his own suicidal depression. National figure. And here at this conference by 1996, 97, we have 2 amazing leaders in Heidi Bryan and DeQuincy Lezine who begin to not only talk about the kinds of things we already talk about here, but about their own personal experience, about their courage to struggle on. And what did that do? Spread. By 2005, Kara Anna, Eduardo Vega, Terry Wise, Jordan, Kevin, others are beginning to talk about theirs. Now, in many cases, there were huge hurdles to do that. I remember many of us rent our clothes when the Bridge documentary came out because of fears of contagion. I remember Terry Wise trying to get her to come to speak here in Phoenix and being told no by state leaders because of her message that it would talk about methodology. By 2011, this voice of courage began to spread further. We had keynote speakers, 4 individuals in Los Angeles, talk about their own lived experience. In 2011, we had a breakthrough keynote by C.W. Tillman and a host of others that were with him talking about their own experiences, and we've talked about Desiree and her leadership today. That then spread further, and by the next year we had a panel of new breakout leaders, Misha, Samantha, and others who began to talk about their stories. And it just keeps extending. Now we have people here at this conference, people from Australia, and somebody's already mentioned Amy today, that in her life talked about her own struggle. And it just expands. These are 42 people who are talking about their lived experience, talking about their lives, and that is now giving courage to others. What if those 2 young women in Dublin not only had a narrative about someone who died, but also about others who had found a way through. What if? This community continues to grow. I've added the Live Through This pictures from Desiree Stage's website. Now, that group can maybe immunize. Maybe it's a vaccination. We'll have to study this and see. But there's a concept called herd immunity or community immunity, that you don't have to vaccinate everybody with the measles vaccine to save a community. It's a certain percentage. The R-naught, through the science, tells us what the percentage is for each disease. It's time to do something different. Now, last year we talked about the ice bath, for those of you who are here, and that suicide comes from intolerable pain. Mark Graham talks about that they've done research about putting your feet in an ice bath. The mere presence of a single caring individual in the room with you doubles the amount of time someone can hang on in that ice bath. What more if it's someone who has been there, who has lived through it, who knows what it feels like, to borrow from Craig's book. This is an actual picture of me finishing the Mud Runner event. It's not, but it could be. It could be me, it could be you, it could be any of us. Are we going to put back on this infectious suit and go back into the safety? Are we going to fan the flames of an epidemic that we're starting to see spread? But there is a courage to hang on, live through, find a way, in some cases thrive, but to survive. The R-naught of courage is infinite. Let's all work together to create a new world where we spread that courage.